In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War began with a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria against Israel. And while the war is remembered today as an air war, it was actually started by tanks. Hi everyone, welcome to Greatest Tank Battles, where we bring you the stories of epic armored confrontations from history. Today we'll be looking at the fighting that took place in the Sinai, as the Egyptian Third Army smashed through the Bar Lev line and then met some unexpected resistance when they came up against Israeli armor. To see how it went, let's jump in the tank and get to it. The build-up to the 1973 Yom Kippur War is well known. In the years since Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in 1967, they had occupied territory seized from their Arab neighbors, including the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Egypt spent the next 6 years rearming and rebuilding its military in preparation for a war with Israel. The Bar Lev line was a series of defensive positions that Israel constructed along the Suez Canal to keep the Egyptians out. These were mostly made up of anti-tank ditches, minefields, and anti-tank walls. However, this was not going to stop the Egyptians, as they would be using brand new equipment like the T-62M tanks to breach them. When the war kicked off in October, Egyptian artillery bombarded Israeli positions along the canal all day and into the night. At 2 a.m. the following morning, the Egyptians launched their ground assault with infantry and tanks attacking in several places along the canal. Israeli troops were caught completely by surprise, and most of the units manning the Bar Lev lines were not combat ready. Aided by darkness and smoke screens, the Egyptian attackers easily broke through the first lines of defense. This continued throughout the day, with the Egyptians smashing through the Bar Lev lines and advancing deep into the Sinai. By the end of the day, they had advanced 8 kilometers, or about 5 miles, and were within 4 to 5 kilometers, or 2 to 3 miles, of the Israeli resort town of El Arish. Egyptian infantry were riding in the back of their tanks. That's how quickly they were advancing. The Israeli government immediately declared this a full-blown war and called up all available reserves to fight. Israeli tanks and armored vehicles began arriving at the front by late afternoon. But with darkness falling again, any hopes of stopping the Egyptians in their tracks were abandoned. The Egyptians had another advantage on the first day of the war, which was a numerical superiority of 10 to 1 over the Israelis. Egyptian armor on the first day consisted of approximately 220 tanks. Most of these were Soviet-era T-62 medium tanks. But they also had some older T-55 tanks and a small number of T-62Ms. With the T-62M being the most capable of these tanks, it's worth taking a look at what they brought to the battlefield. The T-62M was a modification of the original T-62 medium tank developed in the late 1950s. The M designation means that it was built at the end of 1965, making it a relatively new tank at the time of the war. It featured a 115mm cannon, which was slightly shorter than the standard 120mm cannon found on many other tanks at the time, but still packed a very powerful punch. The gun could elevate from -5 degrees to 30 degrees, and could penetrate steel targets at 60mm at ranges of up to 2,000 meters. While this may not sound impressive, it was more than enough to rip through the armor of any vehicle that Egypt expected to face on the battlefield at the time. An added bonus of the 115mm was that it shared the same ammunition as the 120mm guns used by the Egyptian artillery. So the logistics of supplying the army with ammo were simplified. Another reason why the T-62M was a capable tank was its engine. The Soviet Union had developed a new diesel engine specifically for use in the T-62, which they called the G-62. This engine put out around 700 horsepower, which was noticeably more than the power plant in the original T-62. Powering the T-62M was a big deal because it allowed the tank to travel faster without breaking down. It did this while maintaining the same fuel economy as the earlier model T-62. Of course, the trade-off for having a more powerful engine was that the tank became a little heavier. However, the extra weight didn't hamper the mobility of the T-62M, as much as one might think, because the designers of the tank had developed a new suspension system to better spread the weight across the tank's 70-inch wide tracks. All of this added up to make the T-62M a capable workhorse of a tank. It was fast, powerful, and durable. However, there was a drawback to the T-62M, and that was its lack of NBC protection. The tank was designed before the increased use of chemical weapons and nuclear warfare in Korea and Vietnam, and therefore wasn't outfitted with things like a nuclear, biological, and chemical protection system. Another downside of the T-62M was its crew layout. The commander was in a fully enclosed compartment at the front of the tank, but he had no direct view of the battlefield, relied entirely on the tank's vision blocks and armored glass vision blocks. The driver was in a similar situation. He, too, could only see outside of the tank through armored glass vision blocks and hatch vision blocks. The gunner was the only crewman who could directly see outside of the tank, and he had the best visibility of all the crew members. He could see 360 degrees around the tank above his field of view, except for a small blind spot behind him. There was no rangefinder on the T-62M, so the gunner had 2 eyeball distances. He could request a range from the commander, but that would take precious seconds that could cost lives. Despite these drawbacks, the T-62M was still a formidable tank and was more than capable of holding its own against the Israeli forces it faced. As the Egyptians pushed deeper into the Sinai, they encountered the first organized lines of Israeli tanks. The Israelis had concentrated their armored forces into 3 main strike groups. One of these was Task Force 401, composed of the 7th and 401st Brigades. As the Egyptian forces got closer to El Arish, they encountered elements of the 7th Brigade. The brigade was commanded by Colonel Yehuda Lapin and consisted of 3 armored companies and 2 additional companies with older vehicles, such as the half-tracks and universal carriers. 2 of these companies were equipped with Centurion tanks, and the 3rd was armed with Shermans. These Shermans weren't the World War II vintage M4 South, though, but instead were M51 Super Shermans. These were essentially Shermans with a new engine and a new gun. Lapin's task force was given the mission of blocking the road between Cairo and El Arish. On October 12th, they set up a defensive position along a ridge overlooking the road. They knew that it would be a tough fight, but they were confident that they could hold their ground if the Egyptians tried to force their way through. But soon they would find out that they would be facing much larger numbers than they had anticipated. On October, Egyptian forces attacked. What followed was a brutal tank battle that lasted for hours. The Egyptians came at the Israelis in waves, sending tank after tank against them. For the Israelis, this was a nightmare scenario. They were vastly outnumbered, and they knew that they couldn't win a battle of attrition. They needed to stop the Egyptians somehow, but how? Lapin ordered his men to open fire on the Egyptians as they came closer. The cannons of the Centurions roared, and the 76mm guns of the Super Shermans bellowed. The Israelis fought bravely, but it seemed like it wouldn't be enough. The Egyptians kept coming, wave after wave. The Egyptians kept sending tanks against the Israelis, but they couldn't break through. The Israelis fought fiercely, but they knew that they couldn't hold out forever. They needed help and fast. Luckily for the Israelis, they got some much-needed reinforcements when elements of the 401st Brigade arrived on the scene. The Israelis were able to regroup and launch a counterattack against the Egyptians. The counterattack was fierce, and the Egyptians were forced to retreat. The Israelis had won a major victory. The Egyptians had suffered heavy losses, but they refused to give up. They regrouped and launched a second attack, but this time it was even fiercer than the last. The Israelis were pushed back, but they held their ground. The battle raged on for days, but neither side was able to gain the upper hand. Eventually, the Egyptians broke contact, and the Israelis were able to regroup and launch a counterattack. The counterattack was successful, and the Israelis were able to push the Egyptians back. The battle was over. The Israelis had won a major victory, but the fighting was far from over. The Egyptians would try again and again to break through the Israeli lines, but each time they were repelled. Israelis had held their ground, and they had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with. Over the next few weeks, more Israeli armored units rotated into the Sinai to participate in the fighting. The Israelis switched from defending to attacking and began pushing the Egyptians back towards the Suez Canal. Many more tank battles took place as the Egyptians tried desperately to hold on to the territory they had gained. By mid-November, the fighting had come to a standstill, and the 2 sides agreed to a ceasefire. The war was over, and the Egyptians had been defeated, but the fighting in the Sinai would never be forgotten. The battles that had taken place there would become a thing of legend and would be studied by military leaders for years to come. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss an upload. You can check out our other episodes by clicking the links on your screen now. Thanks for watching.